Alright, everyone, hello again. Welcome to the Magic Meatball Marauder, and today we're going to be talking about power divisions within brackets. Right? Now, what am I talking about here? The very concept of brackets creates kind of like a range of decks in which the power levels of these decks vary even within or compared to other decks of that same bracket. So the whole purpose of this talk is to discuss that there are indeed subdivisions within brackets, and that it's best to find which subdivision your deck is, whether it's low, mid, or high on that bracket, so that you can find other decks, or your opponents can find other decks that are within that same range, so you can have a fair game of Magic. Right now, it's important to do this because I've noticed that whenever you're comparing a deck that is very low on the bracket and a deck that is very, very high on the bracket, typically you don't want to match those two decks together. It's like if you were to attend a pro wrestling competition, right? Or pro bodybuilding competition, and you decide to go for the heavyweight division. You can technically qualify, but you're dealing with people who have essentially molded their bodies to be as close as possible to the limit that they can bring it to, versus you who just, maybe you showed out of fun, maybe you hit the gym a couple of times. You're not going to feel like you've optimized your life enough to compete with these people. So in a way, if you want a fair match, you want to try to stick to the power division that you're in. So let me explain what each of these. Low, mid, or high will kind of depend also on the brackets that you're comparing it to, because some brackets have more restrictions and some brackets have no restrictions whatsoever, like bracket 4 and bracket 5, for example. So I think that these distinctions only really apply, I would say, from bracket 1 to say bracket 4, but I think it's still very useful to talk about it. Now, what do I mean by if a deck is low on the bracket? It means that the deck is kind of just barely qualifying to be in that bracket. So you might have a deck that follows the rules of the preceding bracket, or you have a deck that has that's following the rules of the bracket that it's in, but just very, very barely. However, because your deck's power level has actually is actually comparable to the bracket over, it gets pushed on over. So an example I'd like to point out here is that you can have a bracket 2 deck that you've designed, with the rules of bracket 2, but if you suddenly added more explosive win conditions, like say for example you have a bracket 2 deck that can just with the right setup and the right cards, you can just take out an opponent, either with commander damage or some other way. These explosive type of win conditions can push your bracket 2 deck immediately to bracket 3, even if you don't have those game changers or mass land denial. So it's pretty important to know when you're in just very, very low on that bracket. And in this bracket, it really matters what your intention of power is, because sometimes you follow the rules of, as I said, the preceding bracket, but then because you've loaded your deck up with more powerful cards, not necessarily game changers or anything, it might push your deck over to the next bracket. So that's what being low on a respective bracket is. Mid is very self-explanatory. It's just the standard rules. Standard deck within the bracket. You make sure to follow the rules of that bracket, and you're just gonna have a run of a good time. An example I would use for a mid deck is that you can have a mid power level, say bracket 3 deck, even if you have say 2 or even 3 game changers, as long as your deck isn't, I would say, like 100% optimized. Maybe 90% optimized would put you there. But now, let's talk a little bit about decks that are high on the bracket. Now, these are decks, and you've probably seen them before, and with the weight division analogy, these are the decks that have been pushed to their absolute most powerful, while still remaining in like the bracket guidelines that have been given. So, one way to know if your deck is teetering on the edge or they're high up on the bracket is if you can only upgrade said deck with something like game changers or extremely powerful cards, and it's already been pushed with any of the other distinctions you need to keep the deck within that bracket, then you're probably playing with a high, like a high bracket deck, or a deck that's high on that bracket. So, for example, you can have a bracket 3 deck, and I guess I just sorry, I just like bracket 3 decks because that's where I mostly play, but I also play within like bracket 2 sensibilities and whatnot. So you can have a bracket 3 deck with like maybe 2 or 3 game changers. You don't even need to be maxed out in the game changers like extent, but you can have very definite game ending combos. Like, for example, you have like tutors, for example, that allow you to get, say, your Crater Hoof. Like a high bracket 3 deck, for example, would be able to swarm the field and Crater Hoof within the span of like 2 turns. Right? That would be what I would call like a very push bracket 3, right? You might even just be able to do that in 1 turn. I don't know, but typically like decks that are high on the bracket are considerably more, I wouldn't say like explosive, but they are definitely like packing more of a punch compared to the ones with low brackets. Now, this is all nice and good, but how do we actually use these divisions? Well, first and foremost, I think that you can play decks that are 1 subdivision higher or lower to compare it to one another. So I'm going to give an example here. So let's say you have a low bracket 3 deck, right? So if you want to play your low bracket 3 deck, you should be aiming to play it with opponents that have either high bracket 2 decks or mid bracket 3 decks, or of course people of the same low bracket 3 that you have. But I find that if you play against like decks like these within like 1 subdivision away, then even though you're playing against like, say, decks that are like higher or lower, there's kind of like a balancing act that happens within Commander when you play. Like inherently there's an equilibrium that players will reach depending on, hey, this guy has the strongest deck, so they might use more removal on that person or try to take them out. But not every group is going to be the same, and threat assessment is hard, everybody, so that's just something to have to put out there. But that's basically it as to how you're going to be using these these power divisions. So for the future, and I've already done this actually, well I've already created decks on Archideck that I think exemplify the use of both the power divisions as well as the win archetypes that I have discussed in the previous video. And these decks are not very in depth in terms of their description, but if you would like, and if you're interested, please give them a glance and you'll kind of see what I mean by this. And if you have questions about those said decks, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will make sure to answer them to the best of my ability. So, aside from that, I'm really enjoying this kind of format. I enjoy just doing little bracket talks like these. They're very informal, and they're, in a way, fairly spontaneous for me whenever I get these ideas. So, I'm going to do more of these in the future. I don't know anyone's actually watching, but oh well. So, if you like this content, I'm not going to tell you to like or subscribe. Do whatever you want. But I'm going to be putting out more of these in the future. But for now, if you are watching this, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate that. And I know my face isn't showing up on the corner of this notepad, and I'm doing that because, I kind of look like booty sometimes, but that's okay. You guys can listen to my terrible, terrible voice and enjoy yourselves if you can. So, that's really it for now for this talk. Let me know in the comments what you think, and until then, I'm going to peace out.